So, Tyranids have been on a bit of a roll lately. First with John Lennon's recent double Dimacaron win at Salt Classic GT a couple weeks ago, and now winning the Olympus Games GT this past weekend, but this time with a Harridan? Let's talk about it. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about another Tyranid win at a GT this past weekend. We had a ridiculous number of GTs go down in real-life 40k this weekend, and I plan on talking about the incredible swath of results we have from those events and what we can take from those results in a future video. But I know a lot of you out there are here for the Tyranid content, so I figured I'd do a short video delving into one of those events in particular, the Olympus Games GT, and its winning Tyranid list featuring none other than one big flappy boy himself, a Harridan. This list was piloted to the only 5-0 finish of the event by Matt Evans, so first off, huge congratulations to Matt. Winning 5 games of 40k in a row is no easy feat to begin with, and doing so with an off-the-wall meme list like a Harridan list is even classier. Before we get into things, regular old YouTube stuff, quick reminder, if you like the style of content and you like Tyranids, drop a like, drop a subscribe on the video. Really helps out the channel and lets me know what kind of content people like to see. But anyway, let's get into this event, talk about Matt's list, the opponents he faced, and some insights we can take away from these results. First off, before we talk about the remainder of Matt's list, let's talk about the Harridan itself. This is a big 700-point Titanic aircraft monster coming out of the Imperial Armor Compendium that comes with some significant pros and cons stapled to it. First off, its profile is ridiculously hard to kill. Base toughness of 8 comes in with hard to hit as standard, so as long as it's not hovering, it's -1 to be hit. Toughness 8 is such an incredible breakpoint in the metagame right now. There's so many strength 8 anti-tank weapons out there. Things like Dark Lances, things like Heat Lances, things like Meltaguns, all of those bounce off this thing, especially with Dermic Symbiosis. And because it has so many wounds, it's actually incredibly difficult to bracket with Dermic Symbiosis. It also basically packs most of your ranged damage output in a single package. It's like double Hive Guard worth of shooting with upside. It comes equipped with 2 Dire Biocannons, which are the same weapon that comes in the Hierophant Bio-Titan, which is a ridiculous profile. 8 shots at Strength 10 AP3 for flat 3 damage, so a total of 16 shots from both of them. And they come with the added ability that it can ping itself for D3 mortal wounds to get +1 to wound on all of its ranged attack rolls, meaning you're firing 16 times, hitting on 3 at its base ballistic skill. For flat 3 damage, can bump it to 4 with Pathogenic Slime, at +1 to wound, meaning it's wounding almost literally everything in the game on 2s. That's a lot of DACA, and especially because that doesn't require any additional input from you. It's actually relatively CP efficient. You don't need to be double shooting this thing to get the most out of it, and being an aircraft, it basically ignores line of sight. The fact that the model's so large means it can often draw line of sight around awkward terrain, and it's just ridiculously fast, so it can fly over to your opponent's side of the table, look around a corner, and blow up your opponent's stuff out of line of sight super easily. While the Harridan does have some drawbacks, let it not be said that its damage output is one of them. It also is relatively powerful in melee, only base 5 attacks, but it does come in at Strength 10 AP3 for 6 flat damage. Yeah, that's right, 6 damage. If it converts all of its attack rolls, you can do 30 damage to something. No biggie. It's also an incredible threat range given the fact that it is an aircraft. It's probably going to be up towards the middle of the table the turn that you want to send it in anyway. Then it has the hover mode ability like a lot of Imperium aircraft, so it can just become move 20. You can also double move that with Swarmlord. You can advance it with Onslaught. And there's some really cool technology you can use in addition to it. I think the most important one we should talk about is the interaction with Overrun. I talk about Overrun a lot when I talk about Tyranids because not only do I think it's the best stratagem in Tyranids, it's probably one of the best stratagems in the entire game. It allows you to make a normal move and advance instead of performing a consolidation if you've killed an enemy unit in melee and have no other enemy units within 3 inches of you. And that has some special significance for the Harridan because it lets you strategic reserve it. In GT 2020, per the aircraft rules, if you move with any part of the aircraft off the table, it automatically enters strategic reserve at the end of any move, which means that Overrun, as a movement phase style movement, can just send it right off the table. That makes the Harridan immune to any counterattack and then deep strikes back on the table anywhere you want outside 9 inches of enemies to continue shooting the next turn. It's actually some really cool technology, and in those matchups where the Harridan may actually be in danger, could allow it to survive for a couple turns, continuing to attrition your opponent's army to death. There are some significant cons to the Harridan, however, in addition to its ridiculous points cost and the fact that it's a Lord of War slot, meaning you have to take a Lord of War auxiliary detachment in order to bring it, which means that it costs a bunch of CP in addition to not benefiting from any of your high fleet adaptations, which is really unfortunate. It also has limited access to rerolls. While it rerolls its own ones in melee, it only has 5 attacks, and it has basically no way to reroll in shooting without getting some ridiculous combos off on it. So while its damage output is impressive, it's also very inconsistent. Sometimes you just roll a bunch of 2s on this thing's guns, and you just feel bad. There's nothing you can do about it. They just miss. Being aircraft has some upsides, but also has one of the most crippling downsides in the game as well, which is that it cannot hold or contest objectives. So the rest of your list has to be built around playing the primary objective game, because if your opponent is able to kill everything that isn't the Harridan, a lot of times they can just run away with the game very quickly because the Harridan has absolutely no impact on primary objective scoring whatsoever. I've played a bunch of games with the Harridan when Imperial Armor Compendium came out, and in the games that I played, some of which I streamed and you can still watch on the channel, I haven't found it to be quite worth its super hefty price tag. But moving into a metagame where super survivable tanks, things like Mortarion and Magnus are big problems, being able to answer them with the Harridan might be the key. While Mortarion may be very tanky, getting shot with a bunch of 4 flat damage ranged attacks that wound him on 2s is a pretty good way to kill that dude. Or at least keep him very honest while you're able to play a more maneuverable game. In addition, Drukhari also have some trouble dealing with aircraft specifically, so a unit like this pulls the focus of the Dark Lances from the rest of your army, and it can tank a lot of them before it goes down, while at the time popping a bunch of transports. So it might be an interesting option to try to solve that matchup as well. I'm not 100% sure putting a 700-point unit in your army against an enemy army that is so hyper-efficient that they can usually kill a 2,000-point Tyranid army by themselves is quite the way to go, but at least the Harridan will probably survive the game and kill a bunch of stuff. Let me know down in the comments if you want me to do a datasheet deep dive on the Harridan in the future, so we can talk about some of the zany stuff you could do with this big flappy boy in more depth than I'm covering in this video. Given this GT result, I think I'm actually going to put the Harridan back on the table and give it another go post-January FAQ. It may have changed a little bit since then, and playing it into the Drukhari matchup a couple times just to see how it does, I think, is going to be important. But now that we've talked about the centerpiece of this list, let's talk about the rest of Matt's Tyranid list. The list is similar to John Lennon's list from the SOD Classic, but basically trades all of its backline elements for just the Harridan itself, which essentially takes the place of your entire shooting base. This means it's going to have a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses that John's list did. So if you want to hear me talk more in depth about that particular archetype, you can take a look at that video that I did a couple weeks ago. Just like in John's list, I love the inclusion of the Devourer Termagants, and actually every Termagant in this list has been upgraded with a Devourer, which means you have 60% less of them, but because the rest of the list is so focused on killing armor between the double Dimacarons and the Harridan itself, putting a lot of anti-infantry shooting in your list just to be able to clear those horde matchups a little bit more effectively makes a ton of sense to me. You also have access to the Lictor synergy with Pheromone Trail, which is phenomenal, and they synergize well in High Fleet Kraken as well, which you already want because you're taking the Dimacarons. A High Fleet Kraken archetype in addition to the Harridan is interesting. I think a lot of people would audible it into Kronos so that they can Symbiostorm those big gunshots so that they have a little bit of hit improvement on that guy. But Kraken does play very aggressively to take table space, which can help make up for the lack of the Harridan's ability to actually hold objectives at all. The Harridan also has the potential to pull focus from the Dimacarons, forcing your opponent to attack it first before they hit them, assuming you can hide the Dimacarons. That is, I think, a mistake in target priority from your opponent. If you have long-range anti-tank shooting, just shoot the Dimacarons. If you kill them, the Harridan can fall apart pretty quickly. But if you're throwing the Dimacarons in your opponent's face with those Kraken stratagems and engaging their army, they may actually not have a choice. That said, a lot like Lennon's list, this list is especially good into a metagame that is absolutely dominated by heavy armor or elite infantry, and actually even more so than John's original list, which was a little bit more balanced, bringing a Hive Tyrant, an Exocrine, and Hive Guard to make up that backline shooting. That's because those are the archetypes that the Harridan is absolutely perfect for killing. So with that in mind, let's talk about the metagame of this particular tournament. Overall, the tournament consisted of 35 players and had a really interesting distribution. We had a total of 6 miscellaneous Astartes, so that's sort of single chapter representation, either mixed Astartes lists or just chapters that only showed up once, including Salamanders, Black Templars, and White Scars, in addition to some others. We also had 2 Blood Angels players and 4 Space Wolves players, which is wild, coming in at a total of 12 Adeptus Astartes. We also had 2 Custodies players, 2 specifically Emperor's Children players for some reason, as well as 3 Death Guard. So looking at those results, this is in fact a metagame that is very much dominated by those elite, high armor value factions. 21 out of 35 of those lists are just those archetypes in particular. I want to give a quick shout out to our second place in this event too, Ben Neal, for going 4-1 with Tau Empire, which I think is actually probably a more impressive feat than winning the event with a Harridan. Tau Empire is really hurting right now, and it's really cool to see someone championing them and taking them to a 4-1 record. So good on Ben Neal for being able to do that. We also see a big lack of some of the real meta factions in here. Only 2 Sororitas represented, only a single Drukhari. Drukhari are slowly spooling up as people, I think, acquire their real-life armies. But that faction, as we'll talk about later on this week, when I talk about some of the GT results in other events this weekend, is, I think, one of the most powerful things that 40k has ever seen. Also, Adeptus Mechanicus, certainly the most powerful faction in the game right now, and those not being represented at all means that these double Dimacheron lists that focus on big, heavy monsters or vehicles like that don't just get entirely invalidated by swarms of Stratoraptors and Iron Strider Balisariae. So now that we talked about the lists in the meta, let's talk about the ones that Matt faced in particular. Now, I don't have too much information about each of these games. All I have is the pairing and the final score. So unfortunately, I don't know what the mission was, who went first, any of that stuff. That's going to be mostly conjecture on my part. Round 1, Matt was paired against Blood Angels, and a pretty interesting archetype of Blood Angels. The list included a 10-man Intercessor squad, 2 10-man Death Company squads, and only a single Sanguinary Guard squad. Well, one of the Death Company squads came packing a bunch of Thunderhammers, and the Sanguinary Guard are certainly dangerous. This feels a little bit pillow-fisted for a Blood Angels list. An entire Death Company squad, just with armed with chainswords, has the potential to bounce off some of these big monsters. And these are not particularly resilient profiles against a shooting unit like a Harridan. Not to mention that Dimacherons will absolutely rip apart these units in melee if they get the first strike. While it might be a controversial take, I'm pretty sure Blood Angels are one of the least effective Space Marine chapters in that entire super faction. So I'm not super surprised that Matt was able to get out of this round with a pretty solid score. Round 2, Matt was paired up again against Space Marine, and this time, a list that was potentially a little bit more concerning. This was a Salamanders list packing a Flamestorm Aggressor squad, a Vanguard Veteran squad, at least a flying unit that can try to deal with the Harridan, and with Crucible of Battle, just charging Dimacherons with that guy will tune them up pretty significantly. Alongside 6 Multi-Meltas between an Attack Bike squad and an Invader Multi-Melta squad, as well as an Inceptor squad that could come in with Plasma Exterminators and potentially do some damage as well. A lot of really powerful ranged attacks, if relatively short range. So I imagine that the Harridan's ability to hold back and be able to pick off those dangerous units before they were able to get to grips with the Dimacherons, and then being able to send the Dimacherons in to clear out the smaller and more isolated elite melee units is probably how Matt was able to approach this matchup. Salamanders can be difficult if you're forced to engage into them, but fortunately, Tyranids are fast enough that a lot of times they can kite them until such time that their guns are able to take out the most dangerous elements of the Salamander's army, and then they can engage in wherever they need to. Round 3, we saw the train of archetypes continued, with Matt playing against the Shadowkeepers Custodies detachment. This time bringing a whole boatload of Storm Shield Custodian guards, as well as some Alaris Custodians and 2 Telemon Dreadnoughts. This matchup tends to be incredibly mission-specific. If the Tyranids get a mission that's relatively spread out, then they can run circles around the Custodians, kill the units that are isolated, and try to kite the bigger, scarier units like those Alaris Custodians, all the while scoring points. That is what it looks like Matt was able to do, being able to take that game down 84-43. Having Swarmlord and a Broodlord be able to drop those pretty consistent smites out would probably helped a lot too. Round 4, we just continued to get some really good matchups for the Tyranid list. Round 4, the good matchups for the Tyranids continue. Matt was paired up against Death Guard, this time with no Mortarion in the mix, which I thought was interesting. Now, Death Guard can be problematic, especially if they bring their more ranged, focused builds. Well, I think the Mortarion builds are generally probably going to be more powerful. Being able to follow up Mortarion or whatever the frontline unit you've elected to take with units like Volkite Relic Contemptors and Plagueburst Crawlers scars to put out an immense amount of really damaging firepower at sort of mid to long range is really obnoxious, because a lot of times it's very difficult to get through the Death Guard front line. It just takes so much damage to kill those guys before you can even engage with the guns, and a lot of times, especially for Tyranids, the guns will outrange a lot of normal Tyranid damage dealers, and just be able to shoot them from way farther away than the Tyranids can fire back. That said, that's not really the archetype we were going for in this particular detachment. Bringing a couple units of Plague Marines, just 2 Plague Burst Crawlers, as well as a Chaos Leviathan with 2 Gravflex Bombards, and frontlining the list with units like Poxwalkers and Death Shroud Terminators. While I am pretty scared of a lot of Death Guard archetypes with Tyranids, this is not, I think, one of them, and this one seems like a pretty good matchup for Matt as well. Last but certainly not least, that brings us on to the final round, and this is, man, I wish we had a video of this final game, because this is the zaniest finals matchup I think you could ever experience. Now, there is some funkiness with the score of this final round. I don't know whether it went to time, or maybe they just played a mission like the Scouring that tends to be really low scoring, but this, for a finals game, this was incredibly low scoring. Matt squeaking it by 34-17, which is sort of wildly low. It could potentially have just been a very aggressive game on a mission like Scouring or Overrun or something, where it's relatively easy to knock your opponent down to 5 or even 0 points on primary, because it's a hold 2 to score 5 style mission. So that might just be the case, or, I mean, maybe they just timed out and only got a couple rounds through. That doesn't seem particularly likely, given the archetype that Matt was playing against was triple kill tank orcs, which tends to run a relatively low model count and play pretty quickly. This is an archetype of orc list that I'm happy to see finally making waves in the meta, because on TTS anyway, people have been playing it for a little while, and it is pretty scary to play against. Kill tanks are one of the most efficient units, I think, almost in all of 40k. For just 275 points, you get a 24 wound Titanic Toughness 8 vehicle with a pretty good armor save on top of Ramshackle, sometimes just reducing your attack's damage down to 1. So even shooting it with big, heavy anti-tank weapons is not particularly reliable. And at almost 10 points per wound at Toughness 8, they're one of the most efficient defensive profiles in the entire game, and their output both in range and melee is pretty reasonable. But the real strength of the list is just being able to pull your opponent's focus onto those kill tanks while the rest of your army plays around and grabs objective points. Now, the big downside of kill tanks is being a huge skew like this, relying on basically just 3 Toughness 8 models to see you through most of your games, is that sometimes you run into a list that's really good at killing Toughness 8 models, and that is for sure what a Harridan and 2 Macarons will do. Well, this orc list does have pretty reasonable shooting, especially at sort of a low to mid-range, bringing 3 Megatrak Scrap Jets in a Death Skulls detachment to give them maximum rerolls, as well as the not insignificant shooting on those kill tanks themselves. The fact that they're just wildly out-threat by a Dimacaron, which can kill them in maybe 2 swings with a double fight, while they're taking an immense amount of damage from that Harridan shooting every turn, which does wound them on 2s, the +1 to wound off of its dire biocannons, means that those kill tanks drop pretty quickly, and once they do, there's not much of a backline to almost any orc list, but this one in particular. Those Megatrak Scrap Jets and the random orc vehicles in the back, like a Mega Dread and a Cannon Wagon, do not hold up very long once their big brothers are dead. So while the score for this game is a little wonky, I am not at all surprised that Matt was able to take this one down. This one, even out of all of the other relatively elite, heavily armored matchups that Matt played against, this one seems like maybe the best one, and I think he probably breathed a sigh of relief playing against it in the finals. That is the downside of playing any skew list, however. Sometimes you just run into a really bad matchup, and on the orc player's part, I don't think he could have been too upset about a 4-1 finish. If you can dodge your bad matchups until the final game, I mean, that's still a pretty good placement for you. So with that, let's go ahead and wrap up this discussion on Matt Evans' Olympus Games GT win. Now, I think Tyranids were in a relatively strong place in the metagame a few weeks ago, but the release of the Drukhari Codex and Adeptus Mechanicus probably becoming more popular as a result of being the #1 answer to them has kind of eliminated their chances at competition at larger events. However, as we also saw with John Lennon's win at the SOG Classic GT, in metagames where those top-tier factions aren't present to punish normal Tyranid archetypes, and instead slower, more tanky builds that Tyranids can outmaneuver or run circles around and pick apart are present, the faction is incredibly good and has a very good chance of going undefeated. So, while I doubt we see Tyranids taking down major or super major level events anytime soon without some serious nerfs to those top 2 factions in the game, those being Adeptus Mechanicus and Drukhari, that Tyranids are ridiculously disfavored against, they are certainly good enough to win smaller events with a less representative metagame. Obviously, huge congratulations to Matt for identifying that and taking advantage of the metagame at his local events, and huge congratulations to him for taking Bugs to another first place finish this season Here's to many more. So anyway, that's all I have to say about this Harridan win over at the Olympus Games GT. Hope y'all enjoyed the video. Before I close things out, I want to give a big shout out to Olympus Games themselves. I hit them up just before I made this video, and they were very kind at very short notice to use all of the incredible photos that they took during the event. So all of the miniature photography that I had in this video was all from the GT that we talked about. Sounds like they ran a really fun event. They're located in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and if you're interested in checking them out, you can visit their website at olympusgamesandcomics.com. Thanks for watching all the way through to the end of the video. Also, big thanks to my patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise who make this channel possible, and the YouTube channel members you can join in the link down below. They get all sorts of cool benefits for doing so. Early access to videos, as well as access to the Advanced Tactics series that I've been uploading over the last couple of weeks, where we do deep dives into all sorts of 40k tactics content. Thanks again for watching all the way to the real ending of this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.